otherworldly experiences began in childhood. Tell me about your brother, that horrible farm accident, and what started to happen to you after his passing.
Well, I didn't really appreciate what started to happen to me until I viewed it in retrospect many years later. But after I wrote my book, people started to ask me about my experiences and when and how did they start. And with some introspection, I concluded they began about the time of my 12th birthday when my brother tipped the tractor over and it took his life. We were really close. And it was after that that I started to have experiences. For example, when I was just starting to drive a car, I was driving much too fast late at night in the dark on a windy country road, two friends in the car, none of us wearing seatbelts. And suddenly a voice spoke to me and said, "You have to slow down." I was in a really rebellious time in my life. I wouldn't have listened to an authority figure or my parents, or I've joked that if God had been sitting in the seat next to me, I wouldn't have listened to him. But this voice just wrapped itself around me, and I slowed down. I went around the corner, hit a car head on. There was a lot of damage, but nobody was injured. I think if I hadn't have slowed down that night, if I hadn't have heard the voice, I think I might have died that night. And it wasn't until 20 years after my brother's death that he came to me and he said, "You have to go talk with our mother. There's things she's never told you about the day I died."
Hmm.
And that got my attention. I went and I visited with my mother, and she told me for the very first time that day, she said, "I always knew where you were in the house before Stan died because I could hear you singing. When your brother died, you stopped singing." And that was the first time I realized that his death had a real impact on me and the rest of my life.
Wow. Has he appeared to you since?
Yes, I've had a few experiences with him. One of which uh, happened about 10 years ago. I was in meditation, and he came to me in my meditation, and he touched my hand. And when he touched my hand, the room and the building I was in just faded away, and all of a sudden, I was in this profoundly beautiful, glorious place that I think many would describe as heaven. And he led me around. He gave me a tour. And then he showed me my life in review. And he showed me how on certain days when my life had changed its trajectory dramatically, how he had intervened on my behalf on those occasions. And then he showed me the day he died, but he didn't show it to me from the perspective of a 12-year-old boy like I'd always experienced it previously. He showed it to me from the perspective of my parents. And I experienced all the grief and sorrow and sadness, the anger, the loneliness, the heartbreak. And then he looked at me and he said, "Go tell our parents not to be sad anymore. Tell them I'm okay and I want them to be happy when they talk about."
What did he look like?
What did he look like? He looked just like he did when I knew him as a young man, when he was just before his 16th birthday when he died.
Hmm.
And he didn't look 16. He looked like an adult, but he appeared to be in the prime of his life, and he still was in a physical. He wasn't in a physical body, but he still had a physical form to my eyes.
Hmm.
And just he was profoundly happy and filled with light.
Did those experiences, did they predate your career as an emergency physician, and did they influence your decision to get into medicine?
The experiences started when I was a teenager. So they had been going on for years before I decided to become a doctor. And no, they didn't have anything to do with me deciding to be a doctor. When I was about a junior in college, I was walking across campus with a friend of mine whose dad was a physician. He'd known his whole life he was going to be a doctor. And I didn't know that. I asked him, I said, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" And he just said, "I'm going to be a doctor." Just so matter of fact, like it was a fait accompli. And I remember thinking, "Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'll try that." That was my decision to become a doctor.
So just tell us what is kind of a imagine every day is different, obviously, but talk to me about a typical day as an emergency physician inside a major trauma center.
Being a level one trauma center, we had the very sickest and most severely injured patients brought into us from all over the state and from surrounding states. And we also had residents and interns and students in our emergency department because it was a teaching hospital. And there's a whole team of people that work together, particularly when you have severely injured patients, a trauma team. And so I'll give you one example of something that happened to me with regards to a trauma. We got word via the radio or telephone of an inbound trauma patient that had been involved in a horrible car crash 200 miles away. He had been extracted from the car. He was badly injured. His wife and his 14-month-old son died at the scene. His 7-year-old son was minimally injured. They'd taken him to a local hospital, done what they could for him, and flew him to the trauma center where I work. I wasn't going to go in and see him because there was another physician, there was a whole trauma team ready to take care of him, but a nurse came and grabbed me by the arm and said, "You have to come." When I got down to the trauma room, everybody was taking care of this unconscious man, and I walked in, and his deceased wife, whose physical remains were still 200 miles away, was standing in the air above the gurney. And she looked at me, and she expressed her profound gratitude for the care her husband was receiving. And I walked over and looked down at the man, and I checked the pulse in his foot because he had a badly injured leg and ultimately ended up losing the leg. And I remember thinking he's going to lose the leg. And as I looked down at him, I could still see his wife standing in the air behind me because I could see in all directions at the same time. It was as if the whole room got quiet, like you're watching TV and somebody turns the sound off. Everybody else was doing all of their tasks, and I didn't have any assigned tasks. I wasn't his doctor. Mm-hmm. I was just in the room. And so there was this profound communication between me and his wife, and this whole shifting of priorities. You recognize what's really important in your life. And there was this profound peace and calmness and light about it. We patched him up, sent him up to the OR or the ICU. I don't remember which. And I pulled off my shoe covers and went back out into the rest of the department and finished my shift. And that was a typical kind of an example of some of the experiences I had in the ER.
The nurse that took you into there and said, "You have to come see this," and you weren't the attending physician, who was she? I mean, that sounds like some kind of an intervention.
Yes, it was. In fact, she was the only other person in the department that knew I had these kind of experiences because she had them too, and she pried them out of me once. She persuaded me to share some of my experiences. And so when she came and started yanking on my arm, she says, "You have to come." And I said, "I don't need to go." And she said, "No, she's there. You have to come." And when she said I said, who are you talking about? And she said, "His wife, she's there." And then I knew what she was talking about because she saw her too. She had the same experience I did. And about a month later, after this patient had had many surgeries, including the amputation of his leg, this same nurse came and grabbed me by the arm, and I kind of shook her off and said, "I don't like it when you, what do you need? What do you want now?" And she said, "We have to go tell him what happened." His name was Jeff. And I'm not disclosing any confidences because he's talked about his experience publicly. She said, we have to go tell him what we experienced, which we did. We went to his hospital room. And when he heard what I had experienced, what the two of us had experienced, he became emotional and felt empowered to tell us about his experience at the scene of the accident. While he was still trapped in the car, he left his body and he rose up in the air above the scene of the accident in this inexplicable light. And he met his wife, Tamara, who told him, "You have to go back and raise our other son." And he shared a profound death experience before re-entering his body, and we're still friends today.
Wow. Why do you suppose you get to see these things, experience these things, your former colleague, the nurse at the hospital, as well, and not others?
I have no meaningful answer for that. The short answer is I don't know. I don't have a clue. I have learned that there are things we can do that make us more open to have such experiences. We can be willing, we can be trusting, we can be open to it rather than skeptical. We can believe other people when they talk about their experiences. There are things that make us more open to have these experiences, but some people have them and some people don't, and it's a spectrum.
So let's get some definitions out of the way here. Most of us, probably all of my listeners, are familiar with NDEs, near-death experiences, and I think your patient Jeff experienced one of those at the scene of the accident. But what is a near-life experience?
Near life experience is a term I coined when I was writing my book. And the reason I used that term was because every near death experiencer I've ever spoken with, and I've spoken with a bunch, Eben Alexander and Mary Neal are friends of mine, and I've heard their experiences in great detail. Every person that has a near death experience, to my knowledge, talks about it being the most real thing they ever had in their life, that they were closer to their ultimate life purpose, that they were more alive and more awake and more alert. Their faculties were heightened during that time. And to me, it seemed like calling it a near-death experience diminished it in some ways, because what it really was, it was a near-life experience. It was a reaching into our greatest potential experience. And that's why I use that term, near-life experience.
And the shared death experience. I have some familiarity with that term and the experience, but give me your definition and your experiences with shared death experiences.
Shared death experiences is a term used to describe people that are in proximity to someone when they die. Maybe chronologic proximity, maybe geographic proximity, maybe emotional proximity. And the person having the shared death experience is usually awake, alert, healthy. And yet, when a person dies, sometimes they escort that person into the next realm, or they have some profound through the veil experience, very much like a near-death experience, except for they're perfectly awake and alert. They haven't suffered any injury or illness. And these are noteworthy in some ways because many mechanisms have been proposed to explain near-death experiences, physiologic mechanisms like brain anoxia and neurotransmitter dumping, temporal lobe seizures. You've heard all of these and many other explanations. None of them, when you study it, holds up to scientific scrutiny, but people still cling to those explanations. Nobody has proposed an explanation for shared death experiences because I was in the middle of a busy shift as an emergency physician. I had never used I wasn't on drugs. I wasn't on medications. I'd never had a seizure, still haven't had a seizure. I certainly didn't have brain anoxia. So there's no physiologic explanation for shared death experiences as a general rule. Raymond Moody, who's been studying near-death experiences for 50 years, wrote a best-selling book that's sold 13 million copies, called me up one day and he said, "Jeff, I've been a skeptical, objective researcher for over 40 years. And although I write about near-death experiences, I harbored doubts that there was such thing as an afterlife." He said, "After I read your experience and the experience of Jeff Olson, is the other Jeff, and read your book," he said, "I finally relinquished my doubts. I now believe that there is indeed an afterlife."